everybody, and even if you don't have a body. Welcome back to the Integral Stage, where Sir Michael Schwartz and old Zach Schlosser are going to help me have a superlative trialogue on the intersections of education and aesthetics, the confluence of art and learning, and the deep mutuality of wisdom, cultivation, and sensuous forms. This is also, I think, the inaugural episode of two new ongoing Integral Stage interview series, one devoted to the crucial issue of new, deeper, and more developmental approaches to education in the age of the meta-crisis, and another to explore, contemplate, and also present art and design approaches from all over the so-called liminal web that unites the integral diaspora, metamodernism, game beast, synthiotics, transrational spirituality, and all their elusive and luminous ilk. So I'm very happy to have you both here as interlocutors who I know are deeply thoughtful and emotionally engaged with the entangled problems and opportunities of education, art, and spirit. Hi, guys.
Hey.
Hey.
How was that for an introduction?
That got us going.
All right, let me, I'll try to surface some general philosophical points. Modernity, for lack of a better word, is problematic. It definitely generates certain forms of progress and morally improves on ill-informed, dogmatic, authoritarian kingdoms, but it's not a purely good news story. This way of living amplifies many ancient human weaknesses, all those old game A problems, and it takes them up to a scale and tempo of unfolding crises that the system appears powerless to solve. It's maybe behaviorally blind to its dehumanizing and destabilizing accumulations. And a critical question here, I think, is to what degree the trap that we're in can be depressurized, enriched, or transcended by heeding that cry that Nietzsche places in the prologue to Thus Spake Zarathustra, a return to the body, a return to ecology, a return to the sensuous, a new philosophical and practical emphasis on the experiential and the artist as the root interface with civilization, learning, and identity. Michael Schwartz, what's the answer?
Well, first I would say I agree with you about the Habermasian notion of the dignity and disaster of modernity, right? In the system's complexification and so much more. I do think modernity, though, gifted the ability for reflexivity. I think that's often missed. The ability to actually, for modernity to reflect on itself. In fact, it named itself Modernus for the first time. So that capacity of reflecting upon facets of our thrownness at these multiple dimensions, including systems, is a new facet. I think we really first have to honor that gifting of thought. And then there are seeded so many lineages of reflecting on the pros and cons of modernity that I think we just have to be really smart about drawing upon them. Nietzsche, you mentioned, but I think really beginning in the German idealistic tradition, the 20th century critical theory, and so on. So first, I would say the body is part of it, right? But I don't think there's one approach. I don't think there's one cause. I think it is a interlacing set of causes and conditions that are sometimes hard to specify and needs a multifaceted approach. So, for example, if we just stress the body, we're going to end up in a narcissism. We just are. That has to be coupled with, Merleau-Ponty wrote about this. We're going to have to actually couple certain kinds of self-work, certain kinds of cultural and political engagement, certain kinds of moral improvement, and certain kinds of system interventions. I do not think it is it's a holistic causality and then requires a multifaceted set of approaches. So just focusing on the body is insufficient. That would be my first response. Necessary, insufficient.
Zach, given that obviously it's going to be only a part of the solution, what's your intuition about how big a part a return to aesthetics, a return to the body, a return to the sensuous is in terms of counterbalancing or taking modernity forward to something better?
I go two places with that. One place is it's got to be a big part. Our bodies are a big part of our lives. And I think that there's lots to explore in physical cultivation that Yeah, the bodies are a big part of our lives. If we take the field of the body seriously, then we should expect there to be lots of room to explore and cultivate our bodies in lots of different directions. I immediately started thinking about biohacking as an example, not as a good example of deep cultivation of the body, but as an example of a field that already has a lot of richness in it and is exploring its own territory, and feels like to itself, it feels like it's only at the beginning of its own exploration. And I would say that it's fairly narrow and superficial. So that would point to the field of the body as being a very large space of cultivation and opportunity. But the other place that I went to is it feels a little hard to set up the question as a return. I think that we probably share some intuition that framing the work to do right now as a return makes the conversation difficult. Pulling out ways in which framing it as a return is necessary or helpful versus where it's difficult might be a helpful way to understand why we are framing it this way and how we might frame it differently. I know I get stuck in this trap a lot, and it's very difficult thinking that we've already been to, the golden age, we were there before, or it's already present somehow in our bodies or in our senses or something like this. Immediately feels like it cuts off the possibility to do the work that's necessary. So I would want to challenge us to either unpack why we're framing it that way in the first place and what the downsides and upsides are, or to try to abandon it altogether and to frame the relationship with the body as something totally new, if possible.
I certainly agree. There's a human tendency to take what we want to achieve and to retroactively imagine it into the past. And I think converse to that, one of the arguments in favor of doing it that way is a sense, whether it's real or not, that archaically aesthetics was deeply interpenetrant with all the other areas of society and learning. And that even if they didn't have the reflexive capacity that Michael was saying modernity introduces, just the way they lived and their embeddings and their imperatives may have forced them to be like the rest of nature, kind of beautiful, kind of aesthetic, kind of organic in everything they did. And now we're in a situation where we reflexively or post-reflexively are suffering from a kind of cleavage between aesthetics and everything else we do. So there's something we seem to be able to gain by our intuition that it wasn't always this way. And right now we seem to have a situation where if aesthetics is handled at all, it's kind of quarantined as an optional subset of education. You can take a special class on art, and we'll get an annex for that if there happens to be any funding left over for these secondary luxury courses. But how do we move from that to something that we intuitively associate with the past and want for the future, which is an interweaving of art throughout the whole curriculum, or indeed understanding aesthetics to be the very heart of the interface through which human beings assimilate understanding? Michael, what's the argument for having aesthetics permeate all modes of learning?
Well, you just made the argument, but I'm in the university. I don't think that's something that's just going to come forward in the majority of educational settings. I'd like to pick up on the issue of interpenetration and differentiation. I think this is really essential and goes back to what Zach was saying and you were saying earlier about the body and projecting into the past. Yeah, I think one of the insights of the critical theoretical tradition that comes from Weber and Habermas and others is the differentiation of value spheres. So the rough analogy would be something like an organism. Like you have these undifferentiated cells in an organism, and as they differentiate, they specialize, right? That brings in new capacities. And so loosely analogous are our systems and fields of practice have differentiated. They've brought in enhanced capacities, right? Greater capacity, but they don't have an organizing. They're not organized. They're imbalanced in this growth process. So, yeah, what's happened is the power of instrumental thinking, the ability to manipulate nature, third person stance, means ends, has become so pervasive behind our backs, this instrumental rationality, that we don't even know when we're doing it, even in spheres like the moral or the aesthetic. It's just become very pervasive. And it's, as you were saying, you beautifully said at the beginning, it really is an older problem of humanity in new guise. It's fear-based. It's survival fear-based. You know, the Horkheimer and Adorno wrote about this in the Dialectic of the Enlightenment, that those earlier forms, the mythic forms, which were meant to cure fear, just get sublimated into modern Cartesian rationality to overcome the doubt and the anxiety in order to be able to manipulate with certainty. Truth becomes certainty, or at least predictability in some sense. So that's what's pervading. That's what's pushing out and colonizing, you know, the moral sphere, which I think is decimated, what we think morality is, the ethical sphere, and clearly aesthetic sphere. So I think the first is to get a handle on what the pathologies are, what the inherited pathologies are in these imbalanced developments, the shapes they take, and how they actually affect our thinking about the problems, so we can begin to twist free of those and address them. So I'm kind of being a little sort of stepping back on the kind of question you're asking.
That's a really, I mean, it conjures up for me this notion that we have an ancient intuition that we want to reflexively amplify, and we need to do so as a counter pervading, because the default pervading is an anxiety that modernity captures and amplifies from normal human experience over history. So to promote aesthetics vigorously enough that it can act as a counter pervading element to the negative one that we inherit is fascinating. Touching on what Michael said around pathology, Zach, I want to phrase this around past and future, just where you left off. Like, we have this sort of, it's generally recognized sense that there was a huge ugliness in part of the 20th century, that highway parking lot and shopping mall American cities and the oppressive gray blocks of Soviet urban functionalism were notably uninspiring. And do we think of this stuff? Do we think
they're inspiring us enough to talk about them right now, and they're uninspiring us? So, yeah.
If there's a contemporary problem, a modern problem with ugly and uninspiring and non-rich, non-organic landscapes and civic aesthetics, is this, do we think, downstream of some cultural trauma or perverse relation to eros or ancient bad habits? Or do we make ourselves aesthetically numb and sensuously retarded just because we've had to live with these ugly utilitarian things we've built? Which way does the causality flow? Do we set these things up for some good reason, and as a result of living with them, we've become aesthetically inadequate to produce the kind of world we live in? Or is there some ancient problem, some pathology that's led us down the track of setting things up in ways that are non-aesthetic to our human nature?
I mean, yeah, my first answer has got to be both. I can't imagine it being one or the other. It seems like it kind of feeds back on itself. I'm sort of answering in a little bit of a hesitating way, because I feel like there's probably good evidence if someone studies history to give a historical answer to that part of the question, which I don't feel capable to do, actually. But yeah, I mean, a couple things. So, like, if it's the case that, one going backward and one going forward. So if it's the case that the 20th century was strikingly unaesthetic, uninspired, then it means that everything before then was relatively more inspired and aesthetic. So having this curious thought, like, were we just so, as a species and as cultures, were we just so practiced or suffused with or used to the aesthetic and its not the aesthetic, everything has an aesthetic, but the beautiful, let's say, and the beautiful as integrated with nature and as integrated with our cultures? Were we just so used to that we were fine with a period of going in a different direction and sacrificing that for a while? So that's the past. The question is, the future thing that comes up for me is, I'm finding it implicit in the way that I'm tending to think of the aesthetic right now as if it's for it, especially as we're contextualizing it somewhat separate from utilitarian motivations, means ends motivations, as for itself or as for our own experience of the beautiful. But I want to bring in a little bit more of something like means ends thinking, though it'd be interesting to hear from both of you if you feel like it's different in some way, because that feels a little bit flat to me. It's not the place that I get most excited about beauty. The place I get most excited about beauty is it as a kind of navigational communication. Someone speaking to us and speaking something to us that helps us navigate towards something we care about even more deeply and want to bring forward than we're experiencing now. That's especially relevant, I think, if we're talking about the intersection between aesthetics and transformative education. Although I think it's deeper than that. I think that transformative education still sort of has this connotation, at least the way I'm thinking about it, that we know where we're going. We know the kind of transformations we're intending to offer. But when I'm this more magical, inspiring sense I'm trying to point to around beauty is that we're in communication with things that are offering rich new potentials for life that we didn't even know were possible. And we don't exactly know where we're leading, but we're following this sense, this very rich, sensual feeling that feels like it's both pointing to our own experience, it's both intrinsically valuable and instrumentally valuable towards continually towards new opportunities.
This navigational element is intriguing because obviously there have been a lot of people over the last couple of hundred years who've been deeply involved in discovering new possibilities in beautiful ways. Right? I'm thinking, Benoit Mandelbrot pops up in my mind all of a sudden. But there's also, if we take someone like John Vervaeke seriously and think that there is a meaning crisis, we could say that means the navigation function has been insufficient in a rather radical fashion, which is an argument for the failure or the inadequate utilization of aesthetics over some recent period of time. But I'll say, Michael, I'm curious about your point of view on the question I asked Zach, which is, one story is modernity just had some functional things to do. We had to get heated houses. We had to, we started these factories. We had some wars to fight. We set up some practical conditions, where we didn't focus on aesthetics. And then we had to live with those aesthetics, and we suffer a downstream problem for that. On the other hand, there's possibly some much older human problem or pathology that is only being expressed in the choices we made under the condition of industrial modernity. How do you tend to look at it?
Yeah, well, at first, I think that we actually have modernities, and not just to be plural for its own sake. So that I think different cultures have enacted these general tendencies and principles of modernity in different ways. So I was always struck in my many trips to Italy, who is industrial, right? That in many areas in Italy, they have maintained an aesthetics of the environment in a way that you go there, you look at it, you go, oh God, we are so quote unquote pragmatic and functionalist in comparison. And then I assume in Japan there's areas, many areas are like that. So I don't think it's simply, everything looks like Soviet blocks or, houses. I think it differs in different cultures. That's the first I'd say.
Yeah, let me just jump in there before you go to the next part, which we're on here, which is, to what degree do you think the ability to stabilize aesthetically over modernity is because those places inherit a lot of pre-modern architecture, art, and structure? right? As opposed to people who were setting up new things in the 1940s, for example, because there's a lot of old buildings and old style in those places that seem to have a more lovely modernity.
Well, what initially, that's maybe part of it, but I mean, this has to do with the kind of valuations permeating the culture. And I think that's a question that would be very interesting to research. I would say that in some ways, America has been highly successful, obviously, and in terms of the modern game and the contemporary game. And it has been exemplary in, let's talk about means and rationality just for a second, because I think it goes to this. It's not that means ends thinking is bad. We need instruments to survive, right? We need to have that. It's that as the world system, the world economics, the emerging world system linking all continents together emerges, and by the 17th century, this highly abstract form of thinking takes charge, a kind of formal operations pervasiveness. And this is where it comes from, probably. And it's managerial. Now, what happens is there's a learning that we can ever increase the tools, the techne, in terms of an end. That was actually, believe it or not, historically pretty new. And so there's a focus on ever innovation of the means. And what happens is that we begin to lose sight of the ends. This comes right out of Weber. And the ends start becoming, the means start becoming the ends. So take money. Money is there ultimately, one would assume, for, to a certain degree, innate human goods, right, of some kind. But when money becomes the goal of a system, as in capitalism, the means has become the end. And so it's an eclipsing of value that becomes systematic and then filters through practices and how we think about things. So it's not just instrumental thinking, it's instrumental thinking gone insane, in a sense, eclipsing value schemes. So then it becomes, what is the value of the moral sphere? Like, what is the moral sphere? What is the aesthetic sphere? What do they do? How do you reinstate them in the midst of this pervasive instrumental rationality that we have a name for it? Another name from a different angle: technology, the logos of the technique. The logos of the technique starts becoming coupled with economic systems that become, just really hard to rein in. They're really hard to rein in. So I go to those kind of critical theoretical questions because if we're going to address aesthetics and we're going to address the body and what kind of body, and I would say interbodiliness. I don't want us to get into political atomism. I don't want us to talk about my body and your body. I want to talk about our mutual embodiment, right? And that's I'll bracket that for a minute because, we're going to lead into the same problems of liberal political theory if we frame this in terms of just individual bodies, my body, my project, your project, additive in some way as a starting point. So that's a lot, but
yeah,
that's what came out.
There's something interesting here. Zach's notion of navigation, your discussion of the ends that have been lost. I'm thinking of some ideas of my own where I think of telos as essentially an aesthetic phenomenon, where the universe isn't aiming at a particular state, but it may be aiming at a particular range of styles that could be achieved in a variety of ways. Yeah, I don't have a question around that necessarily, but it's interesting that we all have some form of thinking that resembles this directional element of aesthetics. And clearly evolution has capitalized on that, which is it's made us find attractive the things it wants us to do. And modernity seemingly has offered us the possibility of sidestepping that to some degree, of conceiving utility apart from what's attractive. Although the natural history has been are we attracted to attractive things? Or have we learned to find them attractive because of some utilitarian process?
I would ask, what do you mean by attraction? And then what do you mean by beauty, right? So I think there can be all forms of attraction I'm not sure they're all what might be counted as the beautiful in some way. You know, we go to Kant, for example. He was really clear that in the experience of the beautiful, there's a suspension of ordinary desire. But clearly, the kinds of sheens of the postmodern world everywhere, what Baudrillard called the kind of, use this metaphorically, a kind of seduction of the senses, is very much about desire. So I think we have to get clear phenomenologically about what we mean by attraction and also what we mean by beauty. I'm not even sure beauty, we have to clarify that. I mean, it's been defined in a lot of ways, and there may not be a singular thing. You know, in Plato, you go back to Plato, you think, oh, the good, the true, and the beautiful, except Plato doesn't have one notion of the beautiful. He's got a bunch of notions of the beautiful there, right? And the tradition has a whole series of senses of beauty. So, you know, I think that modernity has what I would call beauty gone sick, postmodernity. It creates a sense of attractiveness that is now cleaved from the true and the good, essentially. And then it's instrumentalized towards ends that are usually profit-driven directly or indirectly and give certain kind of temporary pleasures. So how do we heal that in some sense, right?
So there's a question around the types of the attractive and what we mean by that. There's a question around how well the attractive or the aesthetic integrates with other values.
Yes.
I think there's also a question around our capacity to experience it, right? We could nominally recognize something as attractive, but that's very different than being moved by it in order to become attracted by it. And there may be some basic affective capacities that people have in different degrees and which are cultivated in different degrees by societies and spaces, which make us able to feelingly discern some of these things.
I would agree completely with that. Yes.
I'm what is it? Affective prosody disorder. You know, there's people who can't get jokes, can't catch the vibe of a nonverbal interaction. And where some people wholly lack a certain kind of intelligence, it's probable that a great many more are subtly stunted or underdeveloped in that same capacity. And to come back to education, it seems to me that this shamanic capacity to bodily duplicate and subtly experience the flavor of the forms we're engaged with is something that ought to be able to accelerate education and could be trained by certain experiences of art.
Yeah.
So,
before we get into it being used, that capacity being used for other kinds of education or experiencing art, I want to stay with just that capacity in the first place and training that capacity in the first place. I was just in Miami for a week, and it was Art Basel, and I was there for Art Basel, and maybe because I was there for Art Basel, I was attuned to the aesthetic in general. But what I found, it was I didn't like it. I didn't like Miami. I was on the Miami beach the whole time, and like literally from morning to night, everywhere you go, there's dance music playing more loudly than it should be, and it felt it felt violating. Really, it was painful. But it was the first time that you mentioned vibe. It was the first time that I realized like this intersection between art, materiality, vibe, culture. It was like Miami Beach is a place, especially during Art Basel, it's a kind of festival. It's a place that people come to show up as a certain aesthetic. And in showing up as that aesthetic, again, which is this kind of shiny thing that you're talking about, Michael, they create a vibe together. And the vibe orients, is both an expression of their values and orients, again, feeds back and strengthens those values. But that is what the place is. That is what Miami Beach is. It's like the whole city and the culture of that city and the individuals' expressions in that are all working together to create a collective expression that like it's like the city as art, the culture as art, which is really amazing, actually, how well all of those things integrated. I didn't like the particular vibe, but it did it very well. If lots of places got very good. So it was the first time I thought of the city that way. And so then I thought, oh, well, that's amazing. All cities, all communities should get as good at Miami Beach at being the thing that they want to be, expressing that as deeply and integratedly as possible. It's very much on purpose. So I don't know if the people who are contributing significantly to creating the vibe of Miami Beach know how to differentiate between the different types of attraction that we might want to talk about, but they're very good at identifying the kind of attraction they are interested in and then very precisely cultivating that and contributing to that. So even before we get to identifying and then training the capacity to notice different types of attraction, there's first the capacity to very precisely identify even just one that you're into and to express just that one.
My mind is tending to go toward the use of this affective capacity in education, but there's also this question about having it, being able to use it, being able to identify it in a very simple sense of being able to participate in just one vibe production scenario. And is that when we see a bunch of people who have that simple capacity to do that Zach is describing, is that the basis? Are we looking at something good to go, well, this is the base, at least they have that and we could build upon that? Or are we looking at a kind of a failure that the educational system and the domestic system and the general culture hasn't given these people a richer and more capable way of handling vibes and aesthetics, right? Do they just happen to love and they're really good at creating this Miami? Or is it a clumsy, primitive, unformed inability to make something much nicer, right? Maybe it's a situation Zach just doesn't happen to like, but maybe he's detecting an insufficiency in the capacity of people generally and a system generally to both sense and generate a richer, higher, healthier version of this, which is then downstream of the fact that they didn't get the supports and trainings they need in order to distinguish richer and more nourishing versions.
Yeah, I mean, again, I would want to start from the appreciation rather than starting from it as being a lack. I grew up in Ohio, outside of Cleveland. Suburban. The malls and the parking lots that you referenced earlier. That was what I was surrounded by. That, in a way, that's easier to deal with than how I just described Miami Beach. It's less violating, sort of, but it's also just way less aesthetic. Like, at least, and it doesn't train. It certainly does not train the capacity for aesthetic appreciation in any way, superficial or otherwise. At least this caricature of Miami Beach does train that aesthetic capacity in one dimension, and it seems like a starting point to me.
Michael, how do you think your aesthetic capacity got trained, to whatever degree it is right now? Like, how did you what gave you whatever level of richness you currently have in that regard? Did you always feel you had a pretty good affective capacity?
No, I think certain nature mysticism experiences in high school, and then kind of turning to, even in late high school, looking at art, going into New York. And we had a guidance counselor who would give some of us tickets to see the ballet, to go to Impressionist exhibit. It was pretty amazing. And then, ending up, part of what I do is art history. So traveling around and looking at great art all the time. I mean, and then reading philosophy to kind of check. It's been a long journey, developing certain, what you're calling, I like it, it's developmental, affective capacity. So it reminds me of James Baldwin. He had an aesthetic developmental line. And yeah, I think there is something probably to that. So and just doing it for so long and thinking about it. But I honestly don't claim any special capacity. I have a whole bunch of thoughts around this issue of cultivating the aesthetic. And let me just share a couple of these, because I don't think we're reinventing all of this. I think, we're pushing things, but I think there are resources in the modern reflexive tradition that exist already. So this idea of becoming very shiny, of creating an aesthetics of the self, maybe not in Nietzsche and Foucault's sense exactly, but that general sense. Hegel had two takes on it, and Roy Blaskar's emphasized the second one. And this was a deformation of the self called the beautiful soul. And the beautiful soul is an ironic term in that there's been a cultivation of what we might call shine, become beautiful, see things beautiful, but it actually is so non-integrated with other aspects of reality and the self that it becomes a subtle form of alienation. And I think our culture emphasizes this. I think that, I've just reread some of the late writings of Michel Foucault on so-called neoliberal rationality. Now, we think of neoliberalism as financial capital taking off in the 70s and 80s, and I think that's right. But there's actually a rationality, a set of reasonings or collective thought processes and valuations that go with it. And one of the things that struck me is that what starts to form is a kind of cultural norm that each individual is a kind of entrepreneurial self, that each individual is a kind of brand, a firm in which you're responsible for your own investment, like a company, like it's a macro microcosm. So that's the reason the Supreme Court could say the reverse of that is the Supreme Court saying corporations are individuals, right? Because the notion of an individual has become corporate. And so, before anything, it took a while to kind of grasp what Foucault was saying and what Wendy Brown has written about this. She said she was at Berkeley. She's at the Institute for Advanced Study now. Is that, what degree is our self-shining and our cultivation of our bodies really tied to the beautiful soul on the one hand and an alienation on the other, a way of branding ourselves, even if it's just about kind of symbolic capital on Instagram, on Facebook, and so on. And so those are the kind of reflexive issues that I like to hold in mind when we deliberate about what it means to bring the aesthetic in a healthy way to pervade the culture. I think those are some of the pitfalls. And a final piece would be in the more esoteric traditions. A key writing of Alice Bailey is a book called Glamour, A World Problem. And she goes at length about the dangers of spiritual development and so on that I think are right on target. It's like you read it, it's 100 years ago, and I read it and I go, whoa, like this is going on right now. So I'm saying maybe I'm alone here, and that's fine, but I'm a little cautious about rushing ahead with these aestheticizing projects without a reflection upon how they can be captured by forces we're not even aware of. So that would be my concern.
Yeah, Zach, when you think about somebody who is making themselves up and staring in the reflective mirror of Instagram to appreciate some simulation of their shininess, do you start by appreciating them the way you appreciate Miami? Or are you interested in the possibility that some degenerate mode of aesthetics might be at play here?
Yeah, I mean, I might be being more generous because we're speaking in public right now than I am in private. In private, my first reaction to all this stuff is, fuck that. It's terrible. And it feels gross. And it feels gross to be in. So, yeah, again, is it a starting off point, or are you starting off in some degenerate way? I don't know. I don't have a good answer for that. You have to start with where you're at anyway, everyone. So, yeah, I mean, and again, just speaking personally again, I've noticed that my own lack of interest, deep lack of interest in the Instagram shininess, the way of relating to one's own spiritual practice, with that same kind of motivation, there's a way of being uninterested which prevents aesthetic cultivation. So I know people who have cultivated much deeper aesthetic capacities for aesthetic appreciation and aesthetic expression. That includes their own aesthetic expression. They also have Instagram accounts. It includes some communication of that to the outside world. But I experience it as nourishing and pointing towards something worth walking down further. So I would want to start from the appreciation of aesthetic capacity. Again, practically speaking, if I was in dialogue with someone who I felt was addicted to the kind of shininess project, just practically speaking, I wouldn't start with complete criticism. I would start with some mixture of criticism and appreciation and pointing towards something that could be an even more successful accomplishment of what they're going for. So yeah, I would start with, if we're talking about culture and our collective relationship to aesthetics and specific kinds of aesthetics, I would if we're trying to be educators, my bias tactically would be start with the same kind of attitude.
I think there's one way of thinking that's possible for us is to separate simplistic or shallow or beginner versions of aesthetic depth and capacity from what Michael was talking about, from the aesthetic being captured by some other processes, right? We see corporate processes capture that. We see state processes try to use aesthetics to manipulate us. We see kind of moralistic processes do that, right? If someone says to you, well, I don't want kids watching this really good movie because it has sex and violence in it, I'd rather they watch this after school Christian special that we put together. That person is seemingly concerned about the nourishment differential between two kinds of artistic presentations, but really it falls quite flat. A lot of those Christian after school specials are not very nourishing and aesthetically nutritious because it's been captured by a different set of concerns than actual aesthetic resonance. Yeah, I wonder if you have any more thoughts on that, Michael, on the potential difference between like starter aesthetics, which could be simple. It might not be very good. You might not be very sophisticated about it, or you might be shallow in your capacity. Is there any real way to distinguish between that and a kind of aesthetics that's been taken over or co-opted by some other forces that are not fundamentally interested in aesthetics?
No, I think that's a great distinction. And I think you can tell. I think you could develop and there are developed tests for aesthetic development that are kind of bracketed and normative. And then you can explore the situation of Enneagram, which I don't hold any of these things as monolithic. It's a plurality, right? Got pros and cons in it, different potencies. We're just talking about these tendencies to get captured in these systems, right? That end up running up behind our backs. That's the cautionary tale I'm telling here. But no, I think we can distinguish those two. I would like to add this issue back to the body, if that's okay. Okay. Yeah. All right. So one of my learnings has been, what degree am I really going to take seriously personality integration? Let's call it that. Not all this highfalutin stuff. How am I going to actually ground it in the world and as a really difficult project, right? Different and responsible to others. And so,
actually, Michael, can I pause you there for a second to clarify? Yeah. I understood the second part, but I didn't understand how that connected to what you meant by personality integration.
The dimensions of the personality as opposed to some other dimensions of our being, which I would esoterically subscribe to as actual, right? Mm-hmm. I think that down work, though I don't like that word, is the most demanding because they're the most foundational and the most opaque. And I think speaking of shadow work has not been that useful. So to give an example of some research that I, really come forward, is the issues of the autonomic nervous system. And we can link the discoveries about the autonomic nervous system in humans, if we want to look at the body, right, the upper right quadrant integral, with issues that go in political theory. So the mainstream in the West, the mainstream political theory is liberalism. It starts from a model of the human as a kind of atom, as a kind of autonomous agent in a state of nature, depending if you're looking at Hobbes or Locke, and that what accrue are rights, and you give away certain rights to a sovereign or a government, and you have certain rights. And then it becomes an issue of distributing rights. And of course, there's no sense of responsibility here. It's about trying to negotiate rights. And it's also not very intersubjective, right? It's not. And so there was a counter tradition that came out of Rousseau and Hegel and others, recent variants of communitarian, that really say the starting point of a human being is intersubjective. And it's not an individual, it's really relational. And so when we look at, attachment theory, polyvagal theory, those kinds of deeply researched, really procedural memory, before memory, how things are shaped, and those talk about aesthetics, those vibrations in the system. We find that humans are fundamentally open to the other, and they need relationships, attachment relationships, polyvagal state relationships, in order to become actually the foundation, not to have a kind of funky vibe that's distorting all this higher stuff, right? That doesn't let it totally land. And it's really early. A lot of this stuff is really early, right? If we just take it non-esoterically. And so if that's right, then the tradition that comes out of Hegel's right. It means that mutual recognition from moment of birth is foundational of a sense of self. And this involves, on one level, nervous systems, bodies that are co-regulating in some sense together. So if that's true, and I think the evidence points that way, and I've always been convinced philosophically and politically about the more Rousseauian, Hegelian perspective and the limits of liberalism. Look what's happening now, an complete mishugana around what a right is. That what we have is, we have to rethink what it means by recovering the body. If we think about it, we can be co-opted again behind our backs with these deep liberalist notions of separate individuals. If we think of embodiment as ultimately, in some sense, simultaneously independent, interdependent, both together, I think the cultivation of our embodiment takes a different shape. It has not only my experience, and not only my experience of the environment, but even a kind of primacy of my relationship with others that's embodied at these different facets of vibration. And I think if we leave that out, we're going to fall in the traps of the limits of liberalism. We're going to violate what's been discovered in attachment, polyvagal, and these sort of deep vibrational autonomic nervous system research. And we're going to end up trapped in some old stuff. So I would think that the recovery of the body, and then where aesthetics comes into that, would be would have a strong relational dimension to it and take these issues into account.
Yeah, it seems like neoliberal, if we want to use that word, thinking and capacity has been able to extract out certain aesthetic elements away from that whole complex of interdependent embodiment, right? Because we see as embodied creatures, one of the ways we get together and form intersubjective resonances is that we behold each other and we like what we see. Oh, yeah, I want to establish something with this person, and we can also point to something that we like the looks of. Let's all look at that gorgeous sunset. There's a heavily mutual element entangled with aesthetic appreciation in all of that. But you can come along with, say, the advent of a marketing society, and you can extract out the seductive element And you can use that to form a new navigational prompt to get people to purchase a soda can or something like that. And you're technically using the aesthetic function of the human being, but you're using it in isolation from these intersubjective dynamics. So if we were thinking about bringing or supporting the interweaving of aesthetics into all kinds of educational processes, how do we make sure that we're leaning in the direction of a nourishing intersubjective experience and not leaning in the direction of just trying to make everything shiny in a way that duplicates the fragmented marketing surfaces that dominate the whole rest of the society we're embedded in?
Well, yeah, that's a really clear articulation and question. That's what I say.
Zach, what's the answer?
Well, I was going to say that there's an eat your vegetables problem here, and I'd be curious to know, like, yeah, I mean, I would actually be curious to talk to parents who, one way or another, have discovered how it is that their young children might enjoy healthy foods and vegetables in particular. And it's a kind of a silly example, but I don't think it's a difference in kind actually to what we're talking about. When you were speaking, Michael, I thought about Timothy Morton's Dark Ecology, and he takes this as a kind of theme, this stack of effective experiences that we have in relationship to the world, and deep in his stack is the experience of horror. And I can't remember if this is something he said or if he was quoting somebody else in the book, but he said he's pointing back to earlier stages of human consciousness and saying, in an earlier stage, the experience of being so intertwined with the entire world, and I always think of some being, in some forest or something, or in some jungle, the experience of being intertwined with that whole ecosystem, he said, wouldn't be experienced as beautiful, it'd be experienced as horrifying, because if any time anything vibrated or changed anywhere in the net, you would experience that ripple going through you. And so it brings up, and especially when you're talking about birth and the interpenetration of our bodies, Michael, and being seen in that, there's this, again, going back to modernity, the ability to reflect, but going underneath that, there's this feeling of being physically, energetically intertwined with all other bodies and with the space itself and with materiality itself in the nets that we're a part of. And that can feel gross. I mean, it can feel horrifying and messy. So that's the vegetable. It is the opposite of the shiny, individualized branding aesthetic effort. How do we get people to enjoy that experience and transmute it into something else? Because I do think that that's possible. I don't think it stays the boiled or the steamed broccoli forever. I think learning to digest the gross horror of being interpenetrating with all other bodies in a way that you can't control, that your own boundaries, energetic and physical boundaries, feel incredibly porous, doesn't stay gross and horrifying forever. So, a first step would be authentically describing the experience of the transmutation of that into something else. That I think that would be the first place to start.
There's definitely, there's a lot of different skill sets involved here, right? There's teasing apart healthy from unhealthy, or intersubjectively regenerative versus degenerative use of aesthetics. There's this ability that perhaps we can get better at in terms of just affectively responding to things, vibe detection capacity. There's also a kind of robustness or strength that develops through encountering things that are initially unpleasant because there are hidden positive aesthetic dimensions to things, right? And I mean, we've got kids, and there's a certain sensibility, if they get reinforcement of their basic bodily impulses and a good story about nutrition, then they'll lean into eating those vegetables quite often. Although obviously anybody's going to take processed carbohydrates whenever they can get it. Nonetheless, children have an underdeveloped palate in terms of their ability to sense and detect richnesses of flavor. And so a lot of things are initially very off-putting to them. They like kind of simple, sweet things in many respects. And as they grow in this capacity, which is partly through an organic unfolding in the body and partly through a context in which they are encouraged to try things that seem intense or that they don't like, some of those intensities, some of those horrors are converted into new aesthetic capacities. It's like they're growing in their perceptual capacity. I'm very curious about that. I'm actually thinking about somewhere Chogyam Trungpa talks about drala, and it's like he's talking about a form of energy you can take in, but also an entity, but also a kind of perceiving. And it seems to me that many of the esoteric lineages of history had teachings about how to make contact with the elemental powers of the world through enhanced or particular styles of perceiving and assimilating perceptions, and that there's a whole educational possibility of training perception that we don't have. And a big part of that is to be able to focus it on purpose on things that don't initially seem pleasing and feel into those territories and find what richness might be there. Michael, how do you think about the possibilities of improving perception and taking in things through our senses and digesting them more deeply?
Well, I love that. And I think it's not just about more or deeper. I think there's a tone to it. I think you could perceive with a sense of openness and curiosity as one way, and you can be perceived, listening, hearing, where the conatus is fear. You can be trying to detect what might be dangerous. And so I think Maslow is right. And I think these earliest needs of safety and security are really what this super early development, and it's vibrational, is really templating. And it's an ability to feel safe in the environment, which is hard now because we are disconnected from nature. I think that critical theoretical thing is right. And then relationally, which is inheriting certain degrees of breakdowns in recognition. And that sets up a vibration that's fear-based. So, using the senses to slowly shift the nervous system, this really basic, really foundational sense of the nervous system, into something which is more open, feels safe, is probably a first step in a healing process that then can move into these more elemental dimensions. Otherwise, I think these elemental dimensions for the majority of people, particularly in our culture, are going to be overlays and actually get messed up and destabilized by these very early impulses for survival that are just, part of our inheritance, part of our makeup. We have to create a sense, the system has to start resonating with nature, the environment is natural, and others, where through the senses, actually through the felt sense of the body, through the perception, hearing, there's a safety that shifts that system, that then is the condition of possibility for really integrating the elementals. That would be my view, and sort of combines contemporary trauma theory with Horkheimer and Adorno, the recovery of our inner nature. That would be so.
There's a way of integrating these, or doing both at the same time. For example, laying on the earth and experiencing the earth as infinitely capable of holding you.
Yeah.
in everything that's coming up. That's a practice that I got from John Churchill. It's kind of integrating Tibetan Buddhist practices with more earth-based practices, and it's feeling how you can give all of your weight to the earth would be both.
I agree with that. There's a teacher named Irene Lyons who's developed an elemental set of practices that cultivate that security too. I think there are people, I agree. There are people I didn't know he was working on it. People are working. So I don't think they're mutually exclusive. But going into the deepest sense of the elementals, the most esoteric senses of it can be fast. And can kind of, my experience is most Tibetan practices as they exist don't quite get at what I'm pointing to. They kind of go over it, for whatever reason in their culture. I don't know why, but in the West, I have not seen people healed by those traditional practices, not adaptations, the Kini practices and so on. I just haven't seen it. I'm sure there are people, but my experience, it tends to be a thinner wavelength, not as deeply vibrational.
Yeah. There's a question about what maybe where the traumas are. Like I'm hearing you pointing to some kind of like developmental process, some gradual process in which we would start at the beginning. Maybe with the first traumas or something. Maybe this is too simple, but that's something like that. And then the question that comes up is like, what are the first traumas? Are the first traumas, and two options here come up. One is like just not being seen deeply, and then the question is, who needs to see us? To me, it seems like the easiest thing would be for another human to see us and to try to see us as deeply as we need, rather than say nature or the elements. Though it raises the question of whether the earth or a plant can see us and can see us more deeply than a human might be able to. Or is the first trauma something else, something about our bodies or something about space or time or place or something where a relationship with nature might be deeper than being seen by a human or held by a human. Certainly nature is very healing for people, but it might be that it's healing for people because it's hard to get healing from humans, actually.
No, I that's a great question. Maybe it's not an either or, and it's individual specific, and it really depends on a lot of factors, right? So with this research on this, so birth, being in the womb and birth, nervous system's taking shape, something's going on there. I mean, Stan Grof and onward, we know a lot about that. And then now we know all about epigenetics and the way that there are inheritances of traumas multi-generations down that are actually how the DNA is being activated by extra DNA factors that actually duplicate those traumas. Even the memories seem to be there in some way. So, there are a lot of sources of this, right? And I think it's going to be and I won't get into more esoteric sources of it. And then the culture itself, right? The culture itself has a misdistribution, an unjust distribution of necessities being met. So how can you feel safe if your parents are trying to find food or find shelter? Marx was right in that in order to create a social order of thriving, the realm of necessity, in other words, the sense of security, has to be met. And there's something to that. So, I think it's individuals have to figure out what they need to work on when in this mix, and your articulation, I think, I really appreciate that. Thank you. I really do.
There's at least a directional thing here, going back to the shadow work and the down. Yeah, I just want to name, I've been very influenced by Waking Down and Mutuality, this spiritual work started by Samuel Bonder. And I know that, Michael, you've been involved deeply as well in the past. So that's where a lot of this comes from me. But yeah, depending on when people start on the healing practice and what's the most appropriate to work on, we can sort of bracket the question of a first trauma. It's an interesting question, but we can bracket and say, work in the direction of your first trauma, like work in the direction of the deepest thing that contextualizes all your whole being. Work towards being grounded, something like that.
I thought your idea about the possibility of a first trauma being centered around simply not being seen is interesting because of the reciprocal nature of that with perception, right? Is it possible that we don't see deeply enough if we weren't seen deeply enough? That's intriguing. I tend to think of the trauma pattern as being perpendicular to time and history. So I don't really think of a first one. I think of it as kind of constantly trying to enter at all the spots. And all of those patterns of trauma, which are deficiencies and or over intensities, which are different for everybody, and we experience them in different dimensions, and it's ongoing, right? There's no reason the first one is going to be the most problematic one. The most traumatic thing might happen tomorrow. But they all tend to create a contact anxiety, a problem making contact with people, with the world, with some dimension of ourself. And that seems to be a limitation on the ability to not only perceive things aesthetically, but to be nourished by the elemental powers of the world. So that you could have people who come up in a tradition, a little bit to Michael's point, where they have an enormous imaginal richness, and also they have a lot of inherited practices around making contact with elemental powers in a very basic way, like just fire and earth and water, or in a very elaborate way of elemental beings and forces. But if they didn't get the support, if they didn't get the richness, if they didn't have the permeability and the opportunity to grow safely in early places, they might have real uninspected limitations on their ability to make contact. So they might only be getting a tiny fraction of what those elemental forces can offer them. And as a result, they don't get a lot of deep healing that could be available to people who were more aware of the need to go through a discomfort and reestablish a contact that had been lost.
I agree with that. I think that's really clearly, I think that's right. And then there's cultural differences. Maybe some more of these mutual recognitions exist in other societies that had these esoteric practices. Maybe the West, I don't know. I'm just asking. That's a research question in many ways, right? No, we know that there's a ton of research on attachment, relationality with caregivers. It is thoroughly researched, and it's really pre-verbal, and what it means, and what kind of compensatory mechanisms evolve. And then Stephen Porsche's work on polyvagal theory kind of, not exactly, maps what's happening in the nervous system, and the kind of flows of that, and then the distortions of that, and what it feels like, and so on. So I think there's a lot of research available on this. I don't think it's a blind spot anymore. And even epigenetic research is pretty forwarded. So I think there are things to draw on here without having to guess for Westerners. And everyone's going to be a little different, yeah. But yeah, going to those esoteric practices right away, there can be a contact problem. Yep, I agree with you 100%.
Earlier, Michael, when I was talking about the possibility of aesthetics being the counter pervading against the default pervading, you mentioned the difficulty of actually instantiating that in places like academia or institutions. And
Right.
I'm curious about that. And one way I think about it is through sort of civic architecture. Like in my town, I know when civic projects are being considered, there's many factors on the table, right? The municipal government's thinking about what it'll cost and who's going to build it, where it'll go, and its environmental impact. But I'm personally often horrified that awesomeness is not one of these fundamental criteria, right? I think that if we don't specify that the new soccer arena or the new sewage plant should make the citizens go, wow, that's great to behold, I'm happy to live here, then you almost inevitably end up with, almost archaeological layers, generations of people in a place who are inheriting this discarded utilitarian structures that breed a certain dullness and agitation. And that seems to be the opposite of many ancient approaches. And maybe they had certain uninspected constraints that made them be more aesthetic in certain ways. But what do we do now? Like, where do we get how do we institutionally instantiate an extra motive to make things nifty and attractive and vibratorily resonant, right? Can it be stipulated in federal regulations? Do we need a ministry of aesthetics? Can it be left to the market? How do we structurally and institutionally put aesthetics in the foreground?
It's a shift in value. It's a shift in ends. And I like that. What really struck me was the suggestion of it's sort of incremental. If you can begin to getting certain statutes in there that end up in the mix of interests, that's interesting. Where, well, it's got to kind of mesh with the environment. It's the downtown sculpture's got to really speak to that place. It just can't be this abstract. It's got some criteria of perceptual, aesthetic, beauty. Betterment, awesomeness in your word. I like that. That would be a first step to be able to get that in. But then you'd have to argue why that's important, and those tend to get eclipsed by monetary, instrumental, technological considerations. But I like what you're saying as a tactic. I think that's a really interesting suggestion.
Zach, if you were setting up something, right, a new community, a new institution, a new network, obviously you could rely on people that you'd personally vetted who had a pretty good sense of aesthetics and how things interact with ecology and things like that. But if you were going to make it part of the structural regulation, if you were going to install a principle so that going forward, no matter who was involved, they would have to make those things a priority, how would you go about approaching that?
It's a tricky question. I don't know. There's one is I don't think you could do it unless you got clear about the value that you were pointing to, kind of like what Michael was talking. It's a shift in values. So I'm reflecting on it's not always the case. It's obviously not always the case that other interests, monetary interests, whatever, efficiency, get in the way of building something awesome. I'm forgetting the name now of the tallest building in the world in Dubai, I think. It's awesome. But I don't think I don't think it's healing. I don't think it's elemental. I don't think it like calls forth the elemental or the esoteric or anything. So I guess the first, I want to name this difficulty, which is like before getting into the principle or the policy, name this social difficulty, which is that for the same reason why people's aesthetic presentations are captured and continue to be captured by the individual shiny motivation, we're going to have the same problem at the community level in terms of deciding what the things we build should look and make us feel like. It's an eat your vegetables problem again. Like, I think when you say awesome, I think that what you are pointing to is something that is awesome in some of these deeper or more esoteric ways that we're talking about. But probably the better first goal, if we're going to look at, if we were going to have for example, a city architectural plan over several decades, the first goal would be to build new buildings such that they feel safe. They make us feel they are safe, and they make us feel safe and relaxed to do this kind of nervous system healing that we're talking about, where people feel appreciated, where people feel respected, dignified, seen as humans. I don't know what that would cost. I don't know what that would look like. My first assumption is that it wouldn't be awesome. It wouldn't be exciting exactly. And so you'd have to influence people. You'd have to communicate with people who are all the stakeholders in such a way to convince them that this is a thing worth prioritizing now, on the way towards something on the other side of that, which is more awesome and more exciting. Yeah, I think that's the first hardest thing, is getting people on the same page that initial value to shoot for, safety, respect, relaxation, ease, nervous system ease, is the first thing that's worth doing. And partially to entice them to do that because you're pointing towards some long-term vision that gets more exciting after that.
There's different ways to parse a word like awesome, but I think there's value in the intensity of sublimity, right? Because if people were going to set up a safe space for people, there's some different ways you could go about doing that. And some of those are just to negotiate an absolutely banal, moderate, inoffensive condition, right? We're just going to put easy listening music in the elevator because that's the one that nobody's going to have a particular problem with. It's like we're trying to create a safe space for them where nothing's going to agitate them. But anybody with any sensitivity goes, this is not easy to listen to. This is soul destroying to be in this space. versus the kind of sublimity, which is an intensity that the child feels toward the mother, or that people feel toward a beautiful mountain that's outside their city, or some, right? The things that make us feel secure very often make us feel intensely appreciative of them, to the point where we might want to use a word like awesome or sublime, where, right, it seems like a threshold is crossed. There's something to live up to, all right? It's not just we're a little more comfortable and nobody's blowing up our building today, but there's a sense in which we go, wow, I really feel secure here for some reason.
Yeah, I often feel that in cities where there's mountains, and it feels like nature's winning. Like there's a thing bigger than us that's holding us. Yeah, I think that's great. That's a higher bar, obviously, and we should shoot for the highest bar. So whoever the architect is should we should try to have an architect that sets that as the goal. Yeah, it has to be folded in. Yeah, that kind of deep safety that you're talking about. Sure.
There's something about, it's an interesting thing that if you set a really intense bar for mutuality and security, would you automatically get spaces that would be attractive? It's similar to the argument that Buckminster Fuller made, that if you have things that are the most energetically and synergistically efficient in the multiple directions simultaneously, it's automatically going to look good, because that's how nature builds things, right? The people who do biomimicry research, trying to source new architecture and engineering designs through looking at microscopic vegetative structures, they have the same kind of attitude, that if we're solving problems effectively in a multidimensional sense, we're automatically getting something that's going to evolve into appropriate aesthetics. Do you think that's true, Michael? Do you think aesthetics has to be set as a goal, or do you think there are certain approaches that yield aesthetics as a side effect?
I think it's a research question. This is where instrumental thinking is valuable. Why not have with the sophistication we have in ascertaining how people's systems, their bodies, their vibrations, their nervous systems are impacted, you just do research about the psychology of the architecture in a new way. And I don't think you just try. we know little bits about color, sort of, but I would do, that's where I would go. And architecture to me is a big issue. I would recommend Mark Decay's work at Tennessee, because architecture, there are people doing these sorts of things, trying to create buildings. Usually they're high-end individual buildings that are creating certain kinds of aesthetic experiences that are meant to resonate with subtle bodies and so on. But then there's ecological issues, how you create sustainable architecture. And then you have an issue of, with architecture, you have issues of private property. So one person invests in this, someone else next door says, I want to make a quick buck and this is how I'm going to do it. So, but I like the idea of creating architecture that would be in his sense, multifaceted, integrated, and affectively effective in some sense. Yeah, sure. But to me, as part of this that's a research project, I think, a little bit that would help us.
There's a question of scale here. There's a question of institution and implementation of these ideas. So like architecture as a field and the study, architectural research as a field. When we talk like that, we're talking about some kind of institutionally mediated phenomenon. But there's a lot of people, a lot of wealthy people, obviously, very interested in building communities. Then they're doing it, and companies too. And sure, they will draw on high-end architects and who will be hopefully informed by architectural research, but a lot of what's going to happen also is just the people involved in building villages feel like deciding what feels good to them and what's appropriate to their place and moment and community, which is a much that's the question. Is it, I'm hearing something like a Christopher Alexandrian perspective in here, which is like that's a more reliable way to, as a process, to evolve architectures that have the right fit for that community and express multiple values simultaneously, and so over time become more beautiful, hopefully more diverse as well. So yeah, the question of institution, effectiveness of institution comes in here again.
Part of that is the effectiveness of the collective protocols we're using to get anything done, right? This goes a little bit to Christopher Alexander. Like, are we using, as an institution, are we using a process where we think we can use feedback from people who are experiencing it as it unfolds in order to make it richer and better? Because you can easily see somebody, I'm going to set up a fascinating new advanced architectural city, and all the people who are working on it for me are having some particular reaction, but we don't have a protocol for me to register any of their reactions, right? Maybe everybody building the castle is going, this feels awful, but they can't tell the Duke. So there's really, the collective information processing protocols are hugely important here. And I'm not sure how we figure out how to maximize everybody's diverse capacity to do affective sensing as part of the self-informing process of setting up spaces and structures that we find to be awesome.
This goes back to the navigation question that I was bringing up in the beginning too. I was talking about it only individual navigation. It seems possible, easier, let's say, to put together some kind of training for people to appreciate different types of aesthetics, let's say, or different ranges or different depths or whatever, and to express those more effectively. Getting into some sort of esoteric eventually, or some sort of relationship with the communication from the elementals or from the world at large, or some deeper, even more esoteric thing, let's say, and to use that for navigation in their own life. I think that's very valuable. That's not the same question, and it's not the same answer as communities doing that as a whole, which I don't know which is more important or more powerful, but both are definitely needed. And the collective one seems like the harder problem to solve.
This is a bit of a tangent from that, but I'm thinking about the question of mystery. Like, if I think about aesthetics in, say, education, then there's an idea that people who could have more capacity, they might be able to understand things more deeply by having a better sense of how to embody and sense and vibe with it. There has to be safety. And there's the possibility of structuring the things that they are supposed to attentionally attune themselves toward to be things that they want to attune themselves toward because they have a certain kind of configuration that's attractive. And intelligibility is like aesthetics in that sense, is a certain kind of configuration that allows a transmission to go, an exchange of understanding to move toward the recipient from the object. So there's something in a way deeply aesthetic about any kind of learning, which is it has to have a shape that we can register and receive in order for us to learn what it is. And so that puts aesthetics on the side of knowing things, right? To be knowable in a way is already to have the aesthetics, to have the style of something that can be known by a human being. But there's this other side where art is supposed to also place us in the presence of what we don't know or what we can't know, right? I don't want to use Nora Bateson's new term of phanipoesis, but there's a certain informational opacity and complexity and possibly even ontological unintelligibility to the universe. And how do aesthetics, rather than educating us about something, help us to stand before that which we can never really understand?
I want to bring it into the intersubjective and communicative again here, because it still seems like an easier, maybe less valuable, maybe that's why I'm pointing it out, thing to get people to notice that on their own. I'm more interested in, like, how do you communicate that? How do you, if a group of people are trying to build a house together, how do they communicate effectively if we assume that they can perceive that this door doesn't resonate for them as much as they would like it to, how do they communicate that to the others in such a way that the others get that as well? That feels like now we're talking about the aesthetic and the function of art culturally in a way that's very powerful. If we can figure out how to communicate in the medium of the aesthetic better.
Michael, how do you think about the relationship between the communicable artistry of what can be known versus the role that art can play in establishing us in relation to what cannot be known?
I think it's tricky educationally. My experience teaching art is that take film is the first thing people look at. First thing people grasp is that verbal narrative. And that the imagery and the sound and the shot sequence and the lighting and all of that isn't really noticed. So the first step is just to getting people to notice that, right? So there is a kind of, so on the one hand, there's just getting people up to speed to actually notice the stuff, let alone move into the sense of mystery as something that you know but is always receding. That's how I would sort of experience mystery. The second is the something you mentioned earlier, the crisis of meaning. You could run into a kind of, let's call it pre-trans issue of people in crises of meaning who are looking for meaning, or they're reaching back to very older, archaic forms of meaning regressively. We see that going on, and then trying to teach a mystery. That itself could create a crisis. It could contribute to the crisis. There would have to be some sense of maturation with engaging art meaningfully before we could begin to open up the question of how art is a kind of infinite receding of exhaustibility. Nelson Goodman, you mentioned some people, Nelson Goodman talked about the repleteness of art as a symbol system. And it doesn't mean all interpretations are valid or all interpretations are deep, but no interpretation is final. And so it's a training in engaging being in that open-ended way. But for a culture that's afraid, scared, trying to survive at some level, anxious, and semantically depleted, where values have been displaced into quantitative issues, right? I'm not sure the first step is to teach mystery. That's what I would say. I don't think that would serve.
I don't know what's the best way to have an impact on the culture. Like in terms of like, what if I was setting up an artistic educational phenomenon of some kind, whether I would focus on trying to bring people up from the bottom by giving them the basic skills and attentional sets and frameworks of what to take into account in order to start to have aesthetic experience, or whether I would want to start with people who I thought already had a good chunk of those skills and try to breed and multiply them so that they would sprawl out and have a larger impact and change the general ethos of the culture. What do you think, Zach? Where would you start?
Well, what came up was a Benita Roy principle here. What's already happening? What's actually happening? You know, this podcast, your whole podcast series is an educational endeavor. And I would say, especially now that you've put on that hat, an aesthetic endeavor. And what do? Actually, you talk to the people, as far as I can tell, you talk to the people who you are particularly interested in talking to, who are at the bleeding edge of their fields in the areas of interest that you have, that you also happen to think, and this is why in part you're interested in them, that they are very important, valuable things to be talking about and implementing in the culture right now. So there's a thing here where we're not going to get out of our own interests, who we want to be teaching, who we want to be educating, who we want to be in conversation with to educate how much we're educating ourselves. That's what we're interested in, is our own learning rather than other people's learning in any given endeavor. It seems to me it's actually much more like that for more of the time than not. I have experience as an educator, several different domains, and even as someone who really enjoys teaching beginners is not the thing that is most exciting to me. Teaching people who are very close to my own edge, or peer teaching with people who are ahead of me in certain ways, and maybe I'm ahead of them in others, is way more fun. So I think we have to be honest about what our actual interests are if we're trying to be, ask practical questions.
Michael, I know you were just saying you wouldn't start with mystery necessarily. I think, because for a lot of people, you just have to attune them to the very possibility of the aesthetics of a phenomenon just to begin with.
Right.
But one of the other things, and this goes to Zach's comments about vegetables and horror earlier, one of the things you can attune people to early on is the possibility that a wide variety of affects might be worth exploring, right? That things that they might initially class as uninteresting or gross or bad might actually be something that if they paid a little bit more attention to, they would find intriguing. And I think a good example of that is the uncanny, because a lot of people pull back from or marginalize what is peculiar and ambiguous and uncanny. And I think the uncanny probably has a very interesting connection to elementals, or the ancient experience of entity-like potencies that arise in the experience between natural forms and perception, because they aren't all the things in nature that are most nourishing are not necessarily the things that we would look at and go, oh, that's lovely. They might be things we look at and go, that's weird. Why would anyone do that? And I'm curious what you think about the role of the aesthetic of the uncanny and of things that lurk in a way where we can't initially maybe even categorize them into, I like the look of that, or I don't like the look of that. Because it seems like that's an early skill that you could probably teach people quite upfront to be interested in and start to pay more attention to things that have an aesthetic influence that they can't give a thumbs up or a thumbs down to right away.
Well, that's how I teach. So thank you. I mean, so yeah, I mean, the way I introduce it is by I use research loosely of Abigail Hussein on it. She calls it aesthetic response, but it's really art interpretation. There are levels. May not actually be structurally developmental. It may go faster because it's not an actual line, in terms of all that integral stuff. But that skill development can happen. Most people are pre-rational. They only look at things that are familiar, or they have knee-jerk. They like red, so the painting's good, right? But they don't learn anything in it, or it looks familiar, okay. So that breakthrough is an orange or rational or form-op approach to art. So how do you break them out? So the easiest way is to bracket content, and I find formal and semiotic analysis initially is the way to do that. It exercises formal operational thinking itself, and it begins to open up paying attention to the artwork very, very perceptually, right? And then you build in content and context and so on, and all of a sudden, like my art history 1 class was as good a class I've ever had. They can not only do integrative analyses of artworks they were looking at, of form, content. This is about them. They're a super group. Form, content, context. They were dealing with things like modes of production and paintings and artworks, animism, the effects of artworks, iconography of materials, iconoclasms, the differences in cultures of seeing and saying. I'm saying this is what got woven. And it started from what you're talking about, the uncanny in a gentler sense than Freud, of the unfamiliar entering into it, having a certain set of skills and beginning to expand outwards and then dimensionalizing it. That's still not mystery, right? That's still not getting at mystery. That's a harder one. That's a harder one in the culture, because most traditions are if the Cartesian notion of truth as certainty still operates somewhere in our collective psyches, mystery is the counterpoint to that.
Do you, in your teaching, bring in phenomenological practices for the students?
I used to bring in it more, and in the contemporary art class, which maps a history of contemporary art since World War II to the present, we do some phenomenological reductions, bracketing in Husserl sense, because some of the paintings actually are kind of prompting that, or certain conceptual works aren't conceptual; they're actually prompting, feeling into the conceptual-perceptual relationship. So yeah, I do some of it, but my experience is that introspective practices, which I tried a lot in the past, don't work in every university region of the country. I spent a lot of time with Society for Contemplative Mind and Society up in Amherst, good almost 20 years ago, 18 years ago. And they were modeling how to use art and other things in these ways. And, I would bring in practices, and some people would love it. And some people would think, I was just the devil. And so I bracketed that and found that, the culture here, what serves the people here, is actually what I think I've learned to teach after so many years. That's what hits the spot that serves them to help them go in a direction, and rather than putting them into state experiences, which I'm not even sure are valuable. in educational. I'm not sure they're valuable in an educational setting. I think it's neat, but what happens if someone goes into a state experiences and has an ego crisis? What do? How about if you have someone do self-inquiry and they go, oh my God, all this material pops up. You don't have a container for it in university. Yeah. So I don't think classrooms are designed for that in general. That's my sense. Yeah.
Yeah, you need a trigger warning on state experiences at the very least. There's a certain, what you're saying, Michael, makes me think of a kind of tradition in Western intellectual scholarship around this kind of phenomenological bracketing. I'm thinking of Schopenhauer's talk about aesthetic contemplation and things like that in the 19th century. But that kind of Western conversation moves to really incorporate psychedelic and entheogenic experience in the 20th century, such that Huxley is using the notion of the cleansing of the doors of perception to refer to mescaline and things like that. I'm wondering, right, because you're being considerate of the possible uselessness or possible problematic nature of state training, but nonetheless, people are taking drugs all over the place in huge quantities. Is there an ongoing conversation around the aesthetic possibilities of neurological chemical shifts that are going on in the classes you see, in the people you're dealing with? To what degree do we think those sorts of brain chemical modification experiences are a useful way for people to open up to aesthetic dimensions of experience?
In the classroom setting?
Well, no, but in the classroom, I imagine a lot of people in the classroom are bringing in that experience or an interest in that experience.
Yeah, but I think this is a whole question of so-called sacred medicines, and that's a really complicated topic. That's a whole discussion about containers, about reactivating traumas, about healing with them. I think there's evidence in all these directions. I do, but I don't think that's what students are signing up for. I think it took me a while. It took not a while, but I came to the realization, because everything I've done is tried to help students based my limited knowledge, is the university is fundamentally a teaching rational and post-rational cognition. That's what it fundamentally is doing. And so if that's true, that has to be the center of gravity of any kind of educational endeavor. Mm-hmm. And, phenomenological bracketings, working with the emotions, state experiences. I mean, people do it, and it's successful in certain areas of the country, but it's not what I understand. In a way, students are signing up for X and they're getting Y. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Got to honor that. So how do you work with the norms after having tried all these things? And the norms are, to me, is to work in that way and then to branch out and touch into some of these other aspects, right? To indirectly train perceptual nuances, to talk about it in some ways rather than actually put them into an experience. And that's what I have found to be the most effective teaching here in Georgia.
I love the clarity that you're bringing to that in terms of understanding what the function of the system that you're involved in is in society. But Zach, do you think that is adequate for education in our society, or do we need to have something to the side or something beyond that as an educational container, where people are going to explore those areas that might be, like Michael is saying, technically too dangerous or misleading to go into conventional educational institutions?
Yeah, I mean, that's a little bit of a leading question. Obviously, we all think that there's got to be something on the side, or at the very least, obviously, we've all done things. We've all felt like there are things that need to be on the side of that for us, right? Clearly. I'm really appreciating the maturity that Michael's bringing in here about, trying to bring in some of this more edgy stuff, let's say more personal, more personally transformative stuff into the classroom, and finding it not appropriate for that context. And is raising, I'm an education entrepreneur, but it's raising this question for me around what would a similar maturity of perspective have about educational institutions. It's easy for me to critique educational institutions as being insufficient, as being potentially harmful, actually reconstituting the harm. But it's also, there's a naivete in that, in trying to like replace the university and to try to do that on the scale of a decade or something like that. Things are moving very fast. Are things moving that fast? Probably not. So I would actually love to hear Michael's answer to that question.
I had to step aside for a second. Could you fill me in?
Sure. Yeah. Ask him the question I asked you in case I don't remember it.
Sure. So yeah, Layman asked me if I felt like there needed to be, if educational institutions as they exist now are insufficient, and if we need alternative or supplementary educational efforts outside of those to ... And we didn't really fill in the ... but to accomplish something that's necessary and important right now in whatever context we could, probably global is what we're implying here. And my answer was obviously yes, but I've been really appreciating the maturity that you responded to the question about what to teach in the classroom here. And I was curious what you would say about educational institutions as a whole.
I would say that they are on a neoliberal rationality. And I would recommend Wendy Brown's 2 books on this. And yeah, what I'd say is that, I'll give an example. When I was in college back in the 70s, late 70s, you didn't worry about a job. you studied what you wanted to study. It's like, I want to do history. Great. I want to do this. All right. And, you had some trajectory to it. It was about sort of, you had some intuitive sense. You were taking stuff to become fuller. Everyone had some loose middle class sense of that. Really, it was really there. And then, there was a time in the University of Georgia system here where I teach about 15, 20 years ago, where the students were declared customers. And now the whole thing is, do they get jobs, right? Now, this is larger societal structurings, but the university has become essentially something that, is an investment and is a payoff. And the idea of becoming a fuller citizen is not fundamental, because in the neoliberal social order, and it's not absolute, it's plural, but there's been this strong push that an economic model is placed in non-economic functional spheres. So education, which had a certain function, now becomes a neoliberal model of, investments. It's not about becoming a fuller person. It's becoming by a person that can succeed as an entrepreneurial self. And it's a necessity. And that's what people are confronted with, Or in politics, the whole shift with Gingrich in '94, that's when I think it began to shift. And it's both sides, but it became very dramatic there, is an older sense, problematic, tension-filled, of two parties, but there was still a sense of negotiation and exchange, right? And at the political sphere in the Senate, they had some degree of, their own thing, even though they were party-driven, shifted to the neoliberal model of it's all competition, it's all a market, and winner takes alls, and winners and losers is where it's at. So now it's a winner take all thing. It's that logic, that neoliberal logic that is in politics. So it's entered the university. And what's the effect? The effect is that we have STEM, S-T-E-M, science, technology, engineering, and math. What are we not hearing? That's great. Everyone should know that stuff, right? We're not hearing anything about value development. We no longer teach civics. We no longer teach history in a robust way. We no longer, art is an option. Our humanities program, which was at the core of the liberal arts of the core curriculum. The humanities program, team taught, right? Highly funded. When I showed up here in the early 90s, doesn't exist anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So they throw in notions like STEAM. They throw A in there as art, but it's a make me feel better gesture. The funding is for these instrumentally rational, technological forms of jobs that help people go into these areas where this sense of becoming a citizen has been really pretty much gone to the wayside. And it's a shame, because the humanist tradition coming out of the Renaissance of a liberal education, multifaceted, which was for the elite and served that, and then went into the universities in America, like Harvard and those places. After the Second World War, actually, one of the only countries in post-war situation said, let's try in theory to give it to everybody. It was the first time the notion of a humanist education was, in theory, never was executed fully, should be disseminated to the population through higher education. And, it was very uneven and so on, but it's not there anymore. So we have largely a technological educational system in which a techno-economic system where the teaching of values, civic values, political values, is not at the center of it. And it's just the way it is. It doesn't mean you can't do it, doesn't mean it doesn't have an impact, but it's not the center. And that's a long answer, but there's actually a history to it, and I tried to give a little bit of that.
Yeah, thank you. One of the things that I'm curious about is the assumption of the world that's involved in all of this. So we've got a situation where you're trying to bring forward some mingling of aesthetics and education, which inherits some of this great post-Renaissance humanist tradition and does it as best it can within the neoliberal market and political constraints of the bubble of world that we live in right now. Yeah. But that system that's imposing those constraints and setting up the incentives, it presupposes that there's a relative stability of world in which it can continue to operate that way. Now, the other thing to consider is it may not be able to continue to operate that way much longer. It may have been progressively unleashing destabilization factors in a dozen different dimensions of life that are going to come to a head pretty soon, one way or the other, and some kind of radical disruption. So what would an aesthetic education look like that was actually preparing people for the kind of world that might really exist mid-21st century, in which those neoliberal assumptions prove themselves unable to hold?
I give a model, and it's not my classroom, but my colleagues. It's the studio art program. Their this combining of perceptual sensitivity, materials, right, creativity, right, learning and cognition are all brought together in that process and that training. Dewey talked about art as this amazing integrative educational process, and I see it in the studio. Yeah. The studio students come out more dimensional in a way because of that, and yet traditional studio arts are like ranked down here in the hierarchy in the education. But I think that kind of hands-on, it's aesthetic, cognitive all together. So if that could be somehow templated and spread, that would be fantastic.
Go ahead.
There's something deeply exciting to me about that. The studio practice as a metaphor, not very far distance between the metaphor and the actuality. I immediately started thinking, well, okay, there's a craft there. There's a practicality there. The self is infused in that craft. Culture and history is infused in that craft. Is that about art, or is that about a way of teaching a practical a skill? So can you teach software engineering in that same way? And can you do that? And can you imbue what I didn't quite hear in the studio art practice was the kind of civics. So like the values development and the citizen, being a good citizen, that in the studio art practice. So that feels like a very exciting model for a way of teaching any practical subject.
No, I don't know. I don't know what degree this translates into the study of biology.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Do they have labs, right? I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know enough about it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, is it going to translate into an advanced math class? Probably not. Doesn't make advanced math bad. Doesn't mean it has to go everywhere, but yeah, I don't know. It's a great question. I don't have an answer. I don't know enough about the concrete teaching and skill development in those disciplines.
It seems like it may have some components that could be generalized, right? One of them is touch and tactile experience. One of them is in the discourse privileging things that are exciting and beautiful and interesting and expressive, right? There may be other styles of interpersonal interaction or things like that that could be captured from out of that studio art setting and applied to other disciplines.
Right.
Yeah, there's a context in the studio art practice. Why are you making whatever you're making? The answer to that is probably different in the studio art practice than it is for a student studying biology or pre-med or something else.
We did institute an aesthetic practice, if you believe it or not, for the medical students. I forgot about this. The medical school of Georgia is part of our university here in Augusta. And so the art department in the medical school teamed up a few years ago. We designed a practice in which we used paintings in the local museum, portraits. And the medical students would come in, look at the paintings, and they could point every seeming pathology symptom. They're symptomological, right? The abnormal is what, in Foucault and Canguilhelm's sense. But then we instituted an aesthetic training, a way of attuning into the painting and to the expression that's coming through about that sitter that didn't have symptomological. And then we combined the two, where we were asking them to then integrate the two in their perception of the sitter in the painting. And it worked. That's the crazy thing. The crazy thing, it actually, I don't know if they carried it past the exercise of those evenings, but it actually worked. It's crazy, I know. And we did it for a couple of years. So
yeah, my intuition is that that's not crazy. Like my intuition is that the hyper specialization that you're talking about going along with STEM teaching is hard. Is hard for most people. I don't say all people. I think some people just love a subject so much that they want to spend time going down the fractally infinite rabbit hole of that particular subject. But I would love to see the experiment done where different subjects are taught with more contextual awareness and more self-involvement in a healthy way, developmental involvement, in the same way that the studio art practice is.
It almost seems like art, from one angle, could be considered an intersection point for interdisciplinarity, right? There's a way that art could blend into these other disciplines, and also a way that interdisciplinary could be considered to be something that's important to and nourishes any particular discipline, right? Like I'm thinking of the old habit of having to draw anatomy when you are a medical student. And then also this thing that I really loved when I was in high school was we had to write equations to draw pictures, right? We had to present a large picture that we decided and drew, and then we had to present the set of equations that drew the picture, and we had to draw the picture, right? So there's a number of different ways in which all of the disciplines could potentially be drawn into the sphere of art, and art could be used to negotiate the interdisciplinarity of every discipline.
No, I think that's right. I think there are learnings that can be spread, and that was a perfect example of where the perceptual habits were looking at physical symptoms of disorders, but an aesthetic appreciation led to an appreciation of the specific beauty and quality of the people that were there. That was the point of it. And then learning to hold both of those together, right? So yeah, there could be synergies in all directions. And there was an impetus to do that, interdisciplinary, but I don't see it as strongly. I see departments trying to survive.
Yeah.
Look, I mean, I'm telling you what's going on. I mean, they departments in many universities, departments are little firms. They have to, they make it or break it if they can sustain, they get enough tuition coming in, enough students to sort of, at least in part, self-sustain. So it's not, let's share the wealth in the university to make sure we have all these programs being offered. It's moved more towards, not absolutely, can this program sustain itself on its own terms financially?
Yeah.
Well, that's a lot of pressure to put on a physics undergraduate program, or to put under a music program, right? But there's a movement in that direction. So you want to know what's happening? Those are the constraints. That's what's really going on,
Yeah, and the way that we're talking about these problems, we don't solve them outside of larger cultural values discussion that are larger than the university, nor do we solve them without leveraging market forces. Like the solution is not going to, I don't think the solution is going to come from some sort of cultural transformation separate from market forces.
No,
it would come from an example of a program that is successful in bringing in students and revenue and does this more integrative thing that we're talking about at the same time.
I agree. I think that's it. I think there are programs that push in that direction, particularly in the sort of art and design sphere and graduate programs. I think they try to push that direction. Yeah.
Yeah. The intersection between architecture, art, conceptual art, social science, there's like a little nexus there. Actually, and futurism. So like Benjamin Bratton comes to mind, his Strelka program in Russia. But it's a whole genre of work in the world. And that's very much in the direction that we're pointing to, I think. But I'm pretty skeptical of it. It always feels like it, to me, like is lacking that kind of practicality or the teeth that is really the demonstration that we're talking about, where it doesn't just lead to thought leadership or research or consultancy, but it leads to project building. That's the harder thing to do.
That's really intriguing. And when I think of people like Buckminster Fuller, who bring aesthetics and engineering together in an interesting way, he only stands out historically because he's constantly instantiating projects, right? We've seen geodesic domes. And that's fascinating to me because one of the things we haven't talked about very much that is an integral part of art is this opportunity for self-expression. And it seems like the expressive capacity is part of the cycle of assimilating knowledge and learning. You take something in, you process it, and you put it out, and only then has it been completed. And there's a lot of disciplines in that STEM system where you're just supposed to take in what they've given you and reproduce what they gave you as if you didn't digest it and nothing was added to it by going through you. Whereas it seems like projects and making artworks or, setting up any kind of new innovative science or technological or medical function, there's a certain circle that's completed in that has to be at the center of all of this, right? And we're not always going to think of that as art, but there is something that it fundamentally has in common with art, which is that you are trying to output something as a proof. Not there you can walk around and do the discussion and be recognized, but you're actually generating something, and that has to be the proof. And it's also the shape of art, which is to take in and to digest and then to try to make value.
And then you've in Hegel's sense, you've externalized it, and then the completion is seeing it, mirroring it back in a sense.
And
Yeah.
other people, it impacting other people. Civic architecture is the best example of this. City planners, I don't know what, lots of constraints, I'm sure, and limitations, but they're situated in a point where they're like, plan the environment, like plan how people are going to experience their lives in the most concrete way on a significant scale. That's a huge opportunity. That kind of position in communities is a huge opportunity.
Well, we've been at this for over 2 hours, so I could talk about it for 2 more hours. I just want to check in with you guys about time and how you feel and where we are in the conversation. Is there anything that if we felt into the nebulous space behind our minds that we would still want to add in here that hasn't come up?
Oh, I would just say that the call is to be reflexive to the extent possible about what the enabling and disabling conditions are, and then to work with those sites of tension where emergence can happen. Yeah, I mean, and we've talked about a lot of issues here. I mean, it's really been rich in terms of thematics. So yeah, I mean, systems, culture, individuals, relation to nature, embodiment, aesthetics, educational systems, extra educational systems in the university, outside of it, civic architecture. It's a lot of topics. And, I think they're all important. That's what I would say. They all matter.
Looking over the conversation in my memory, I come back to what I think are 3 key training areas, which are, distinguishing more regenerative than degenerative aesthetics, deepening and developing this affective capacity, and also training modes of perception that can put us into more nourishing contact with elementals or any other aspect of the perceivable universe that might be good for us to make relationship with.
Yeah, I would just I would highlight the areas that we only pointed to because we knew that we couldn't go down them and do them justice, which would be, we've talked a lot about art and its function and education in the ways that you talked about, Layman. We only pointed at really the integration of that capacity for education in other domains outside of art education. So lots more territory to explore if we wanted to.
Yeah, one last thing that's coming up for me here is the way that the digital universe is structured, right? That the interfaces are all designed and customizable. And there's a sense in which a certain kind of art is the basic interface with cultural information now, right? When you go through an app or you go through a website to get something, there's a layout, there's a set of considerations about how a person is going to feel when they look at that. And it may be that our brains are becoming accustomed to treating art as the interface with culture and information. And it would be sad if the educational institutions were not able to keep up with that neural expectation.
Yeah, I agree with that. And we're not keeping up. I gave a paper some years ago, and the tagline would be, Baudrillard misleadingly said, we live in a world of simulation. No, actually, we live in a world replete with works of art. We're encountering works of art all the time, everywhere, of different degrees, with different functions, from graphic design to music, you name it. We're saturated with it. And to the extent and we can distinguish that from reality, other facets of reality, but we're so woven with works of art and often superficial engagement with it, it makes this aesthetic encounter with works of art a deep political, cultural, spiritual issue. I absolutely agree with that.
Yeah, I think this we mentioned. I was at Art Basel specifically for the NFT art and non-fungible tokens, which is a crypto technology that establishes verifiable digital ownership and has led to a kind of massive resurgence in digital art and experimentation in digital art and the economics and collaboration behind digital art. And we scratch the surface at this question of Michael, you said that you were cautious about aesthetic projects and would want us to do deeper thinking first about the ways in which they could be captured. I think that this is a huge opportunity again for deeper discussion. Is how is art woven into our experience every day? Specifically, how is it woven into the digital world? Where is it being captured already? Where are the opportunities for it to be free from capture in that way? The actual examples of getting into examples would be really powerful.
You know what that brings up for me is everybody having a digital camera in their pocket affords them the opportunity to encounter an aesthetically intriguing perception, and instead of spending any time with it, immediately capture it in the device. So, and that's trivializing, right? Because they don't spend the time and they don't go back to the device and contemplate it later. The opportunity for a deeper aesthetic appreciation of their perception was trivially captured by the digital appliance. And I think there's a very insidious possibility there, especially if deep aesthetic perception is an important part of what nourishes us as souls and human beings. There's too many questions. We can't go into all of these. We're going to have to end this. I don't want to stop talking to you guys, but we've got to. So thanks very much for your insights and your presence and your humor and your concern. And it's just a pleasure to be with both of you.
Great being with you guys. Real joy. Thank you. Thank you so much. It was great. Thank you.